Hey folks, we are going to do a quick walkthrough of Android Studio, which is the IDE for developing Android applications. The version of Android Studio I'm using here is Hedgehog 2023.1.1. However, any modern version of Android Studio should look familiar, even if you're watching this some time after it's been recorded. The main features should more or less be the same, and you should find them in more or less the same places. So starting Android Studio, we're presented with this dialog where we can create a new project, open a previously created project, or if we have an incorporated version control system such as Git, we can clone a project automatically and work on it locally. Clicking on New Project, we're presented with some tabs on the left for the type of application you want to work on. Phone and tablet is what we're going to use exclusively in this course. And then you're asked to select a type of activity or no activity. An activity for now can just be thought of as a screen in our application. These are some templates that we're presented with where, depending on the type of application you want to build, you can get a jump start. So a responsive activity, for example, will adjust based on the screen size or orientation of the device. Bottom navigation views will allow for buttons and other things to be automatically presented at the bottom of the screen. And the navigation drawer will allow the user to slide in a menu option automatically when they click a button. The two activity types I want to bring your attention to are empty activity, which is selected by default, and empty views activity. Empty activity is as I mentioned, the default activity type, and this is an activity that uses the modern Compose UI framework. So this is the more recent version of the toolkit that is used to create the user interface for Android applications. And empty views activity is the activity type that utilizes the original Views SDK. In this course, we will talk about both, but for now, the vast majority of our applications will utilize the Views framework or the original UI framework. So whenever you're creating an application for this course, just ensure that instead of selecting empty activity, you select empty views activity. If you select empty activity by default at the beginning of a project, the easiest thing to do, quite frankly, is just to close that project and start over. If you accidentally add a compose activity into an already established project, then at that point you may want to extract the activity and the associated libraries and artifacts that might be added to your project. Or if you were using a version control system, just roll back to the previous commit that did not have the compose activity added. So we're going to select empty views activity. Then we'll be asked a few questions. First, we'll be asked the name of our application. And below that, we'll see the package name, which uses the reverse domain notation that you might be familiar with from Java programs. And the package name becomes the reverse domain along with the name of the application. You're asked to select a location, the language. Very likely you'll be using Kotlin for most of whatever you'll be doing. And minimum SDK. The minimum SDK has implications for features, and certainly when you want to distribute an application, you'll want to be mindful of how many users are running a specific version of Android Studio and use that, a specific version of Android. And you will use that to determine what version of the API to target. So here we're just leaving it as a default, which is 34, one of the more recent API versions for Android as we record this. And we will leave the build configuration language as Kotlin DSL. And then we'll hit finish. And in a few seconds, we're presented with our UI. The project is still being built. You'll notice here, close to the bottom right, you'll see a progress bar. And my recommendation is whenever you see this progress bar running, just let it finish before you try to do anything else in the IDE. All tasks that the IDE is performing should be queued and be executed in order. So it shouldn't really pose much of a problem. However, until a particular task is finished, you may not have access to certain features in the IDE. And there's just always the potential for some problem to present itself if you try to do too many things while the IDE is busy. So I always recommend just holding off. Okay, here on the left, we have our Project Explorer. I just used the general name that you might use across different IDEs, but here's where we see the various aspects of our project. What's important here is that as we're looking at the project and we see different pieces, here we see where the manifest files will be. This is sort of a descriptor for the different components in our application. Then we see our activity file. This is where we'll be basically writing all of our Kotlin code. And then here we see resources, and a resource in Android is a non-code artifact. So different things can fall under the category of resources, things like images or pre-written text, etc. And we'll cover all of those later on, but it can all be found here. And then we also have Gradle scripts. These can be thought of as configuration or settings that the IDE will reference to set things up or to execute your project in a particular way. They can always be modified and changed. You will hardly ever visit here. You may just need to change one or two things for some project, but by and large, you don't really use this when you're developing. You just change certain settings if you need to, and you spend most of your time here. In the Project Explorer, however, what we should note is that Android Studio has the ability to present your project to you in different ways. By default, at least right now, it's showing me the Android view, which is not the actual way that the project is laid out on disk, not the way that it's stored. This is just a specific view or an arrangement to make navigating easier. If I wanted to see my project, then I would select something like project, and this shows me exactly what it's like on disk. So I'm seeing the actual arrangement of files, and I'm also seeing some files that are not presented to me if I'm in the Android view, because they're not necessarily relevant for most of the projects you'll be working on. But just keep in mind that under some circumstances, you may want to switch the view to one of these, and the name sort of tells you what they're doing, but project is probably the one that's just more straightforward. It just kind of shows you everything. All right, so we're going to switch back to Android and move on. On the right, we have the viewer, and the viewer is what will show us whatever active files we're working on. So in this case, I see that I'm working on main activity.kt. So that's the activity that was created for me when I selected a basic, or rather empty view activity. And right now we see that it simply is a class with a single function, and we will talk about all of these later on. Additionally, there is one resource file, specifically a layout file open, and I'll just show you where to find that file. It's under resources, layout, and activity main. And if you click here or just switch over to the tab here, we see what is essentially a WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get editor, where I can move things around, add elements to a screen, and all of these will be used as the UI or the user interface for my activity once the application is running. So these are all the things we'll discuss later on. Continuing our tour of the IDE. On the left, I have some tabs. The left bottom, build screen, the logcat. This is what will allow me to see log messages, any sort of issues with my project I can see here. Insights, we'll skip that for now. Terminal, this is where I can, for Windows, I'll get a command shell. On Linux, I'll get a terminal. or a terminal on Mac too, I believe. And here I can just execute my normal terminal commands. So this can be extremely useful if you want to just, for example, delete files or reset a Git repository or whatever else, where navigating the IDE might not be the fastest or the most ideal, or it just doesn't have the capability or the feature that you'd like. You can drop to the terminal and do different things. And once you have Git set up, you can actually get a Git view so you can see the different branches of your application, of your code, etc. Continuing on the top right in my version, I see some additional capabilities. So the run app, this should be pretty straightforward. Clicking on this will run the app in whatever form it's in. There is a debug app right next to it, which will allow you to set breakpoints. And then whenever you click on debug, those breakpoints will essentially halt execution of your app at that point, and you'll get a dump of your application's memory. So you can examine it to see if there are any issues, any bugs, anything that you want to fix. You get to examine the current state of your application. And because executing with breakpoints is done using the debug app, it means whenever you don't want to debug, you just want to do a straight execution, you don't need to remove the breakpoints. Just ensure that you go back to run app. And so that's one of the nicer features here. Continuing across, these are again other ways to execute the app, but I want to bring your attention to two things. So under menu, I'll go to Tools, and here I will see the Device Manager and the SDK Manager. Taking a look at the SDK Manager first, this will allow me to download different versions of Android for development. So this will allow me to target and build on a different version, from the latest version all the way back to the oldest supported versions of Android. Clearly, I can only assume these are here for research purposes, but it's not practical to build an application for these old versions and distribute them. But certainly if you want to download a particular version of Android and target and build for that, this is where you would do it. And the second feature is, again, under Tools, the Device Manager. So the Device Manager, also available as a tab on the right, unless you've hidden it, is where I can create a virtual device that allows me to run and debug my applications without needing to connect a physical device. So right now I have no devices, so I can click Create Virtual Device. And then I'm given the ability to select a type of device, so a phone, a tablet, Wear OS, which is a watch, desktop, TV, automotive. So we're going to go to phone, and then here I see some templates for different Google devices, as well as just generic small phones, medium phones, etc. I have the ability also to create my own profile or to import a hardware profile if you are provisioned with a profile for, let's say, some other device, a profile matching a physical device that exists in the real world but is not built into Android Studio. Hitting next, I'm asked to select the version of Android that should run on this device. I have the ability to download any version that is not currently downloaded to my system. So for example, I could click on R and this will do a download and extract and then use that version of Android to run my virtual device. And to be clear, the virtual device here is an emulator, not a simulator, as is the case with, say, iOS. And the difference ultimately boils down to an emulator is running the real software, the real operating system. That has benefits, but it also has some downsides. For example, emulators tend to be slower because it's the full-fledged operating system. And it can also run into just bugs and errors. Different things can creep up that tend to be less present when you're operating on simulators. Although that's not necessarily a rule, it just tends to happen that way. So I've selected R, downloaded it, And now I can make any final changes I want. So what do I want to call this? It's good to give the phone some name that includes the API version, because you may want to have multiple virtual devices created and you want to be able to select different virtual devices to test your app. So the fact that this is a phone running API 30, that's good to leave it in the name. If I were to create a tablet running API 34, then I'd want that to be clear to me as well. Coming down and clicking Show Advanced Settings, just to quickly see some of the other things we can modify about our device. I can specify if I'd like my device to start up in portrait or landscape. I can attach the virtual camera to a real camera. So that is your webcam, or just leave it as emulated and you won't see anything. Network speed, I can modify. I can specify if this device should start with a cold boot every time. A cold boot basically means it starts as if you just turned on the device, whereas a quick boot is the device is started from a previous snapshot. So the last time you ran the emulator successfully, a snapshot is taken. Well, I should say, a snapshot is taken right before you close the device, and then it is that snapshot is used to start up the next time. So quick boots are preferred as your normal way to start a device. Just note that if you ever have quick boot selected as the default, or your device is in quick boot mode, and you run into some issue with the emulator that causes it to freeze or to not progress in any way, then you may need to force a cold boot, because ultimately, if you're in quick boot and the device is unstable, closing it and running it again is just going to start with the same snapshot from the last time. So it doesn't actually help you. So you may need to force a quick boot. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Here we can modify the specifications of the device. How much RAM do I want? Storage do I want? So to have an SD card. And again, these are all really geared towards ensuring that you can emulate certain characteristics of a device that might be used in the real world to test how your application performs, or to allow you to work on specific features. So if you're building an app that is supposed to work on a device with low storage, or low memory, then you want to be able to modify that such that you can verify that the application does what you'd like it to do. And enable input keyboard basically allows you to map to your physical keyboard. Hitting finish, I now have the device, and I can run that device. Since it's a cold boot, it might take a moment to start up, which is again why quick boot is ideal. And here on the right, you can actually see the tabs, the device manager tab, which is where we were when we were creating the device. And then running devices is what's going to show me the emulator as it's executing. Under the settings of Android Studio, I can make this a separate window, so I can pop it out of the IDE. If screen real estate is a problem for me, if I had a smaller screen, you can put this in its own window so that you have more screen to do your development, more screen real estate. While that's booting, I'll just show you how you can do the quick boot in case you run into issues. It's basically going to the device manager, finding these three dots on the right for menu. And then you can basically go all the way down and, oh, actually, it's actually right at the top. It's just not available to me because the device is still booting. But selecting cold boot will force the reboot of the device, and it will be as if you turn it on for the first time. And here you can see other things. I can edit. So I basically go back to the screens that I just completed and modify something. I can create a second version of this. I can wipe the data. Remember, this is an emulator, so everything you're doing, it's behaving like it's a real phone, including any apps you install, any data you save, it's all there. So that can start to fill up. And if you'd like to bring the device back to its original state without having to create a new device, just hit wipe data. And of course, you can just delete it if you'd like. Other settings as well. And let's now see where we are. Here we have the device running. And again, this is where I would be able to install my applications. I would see it here, and I can do my development that way. All right. And There are quite a few other features here that we will come across as we start to work on our applications. But for the most part, these are they. Running my application here. So this is actually a good opportunity to show something. So the device I just created is Android API 30. That's one I installed. That's what I downloaded. But my application has a minimum API of 34, which basically means my application cannot run on this device. So this is not a problem for me because I have a few options available. I could go ahead and just create a new virtual device that has API 34 as the operating system that's running on it, that version of Android. Or I could modify this device to change the API to version 34. But perhaps the most straightforward thing I can do here, and that is because my application is simple enough that I don't need it to have such a high minimum number. I'm not using any of the latest features of Android. So I can just go to my Gradle scripts, go to the build.gradle.kts for the app module. And here I'll see the various API settings. There's a compile SDK, a minimum SDK, and a target SDK, each set to 34. So if I set the minimum SDK to 30, and because I changed something in the configuration, I need to click this Sync Now option, which only appears when you've made a change. That has now changed the minimum version of Android that this application will support. And if you'd noticed before, there was a little thing here telling me that there was a problem, that my application couldn't run on this. It's no longer there. I hit run. The app compiles. The device starts up. There's the quick boot. Even though I closed it, it popped up really quickly versus the first time. And once the app is completed, it will be transferred using something called Android Debug Bridge, or ADB, to the device. It will execute, and we should see the app showing me my default screen, which was Hello World. And here we see it, Hello World. So this is my basic application. A quick run through of Android Studio, at least insofar as it allows us to get a basic application up and running. There are tons of features that are supported by this IDE. It's a very complex piece of software. So we will take our time to understand more of the tool as we understand more about Android development. But this is, for us, a pretty good starting point.